mother was often beaten as a child by neighborhood kids for being a Jew, with no other parents intervening in the beatings, which often left her scarred and bleeding. My grandmother was fired from her job as a popular news anchor after word spread that she was Jewish, with those in charge not wanting a Jew on television screens in the Soviet Union. My grandfather was a very well-known artist who was never allowed to paint what he wanted or to express himself if it involved his religion in any way. Both of my mom's parents came from very observant families, and though being a devout Jew was extremely difficult back in the Soviet Union, my grandfather made sure to never miss a religious service on a high holiday. He never brought my grandmother or great-grandmother along with him because of the risks of attending a synagogue where people were often attacked or even arrested. My grandfather had always wanted to escape. It was his status as a well-known artist, though, that made it practically impossible. My grandfather had often begged the government to allow him to travel to other countries in order to view the artwork of different artists around the world. However, he was never allowed to travel outside of the Soviet Union, as the government was concerned about the possibility of him not returning and embarrassing the Soviet system as others had. On one occasion, my grandparents were allowed to visit Finland, but had to leave my young aunt behind as insurance so the government could be confident that they would come back. My grandpa used to listen to his favorite station, Voice of America, on the radio, usually hiding in a bathroom or closet and making sure to cover the radio with blankets so no neighbors would hear the station he was listening to and report him. In 1973, President Nixon traveled to the Soviet Union and made a deal with Leonid Brezhnev, then leader of the Soviet Union, which allowed for, to put it simply, the emigration of thousands of Jews in exchange for a certain number of tons of grain. And though the deal was purposely not publicized anywhere on the Soviet news channels, my grandfather heard about it on Voice of America and applied immediately. My grandparents knew that they would have only one opportunity to leave, so when my great-grandmother suffered a heart attack they thought could take her life, they had to make the difficult decision to stay or to leave her and other relatives behind. My grandparents, 13-year-old aunt and 10-year-old mom, left with $90 per person, all they were allowed to take with them. Ironically, to give up their Soviet citizenship, they had to pay almost 1,000 rubles per person to the government. So my grandfather made sure to save up and borrow from friends and strangers in order to leave each member of his family staying behind with enough money to make their escape if they ever could. My father has a very different story. He did not leave the Soviet Union because of hardships. In fact, he often told me how well off he and his family members were in Estonia. Both of my father's parents were famous lawyers, with my grandfather being one of very few lawyers in the Soviet Union who had permission to represent clients in politically sensitive cases. Doing so often required access to different bodies in the government and sensitive information, and therefore he ended up participating in many controversial cases in the Soviet Union, many of them even known in the West. He was involved in the case of the ship captain who was court-martialed and whose story became the basis for the book and movie The Hunt for Red October. He also represented family members of the Soviet Politburo, some of the most powerful people in the Soviet Union. At the same time, the government had set its sights on my grandmother because as a lawyer, she often advised Estonian dissidents. And for my grandfather, it would be extremely difficult to leave his established position behind, something he knew he would never get permission to do. This left my grandparents to decide whether to stay and face an oppressive regime or to say their goodbyes and let my grandmother try to flee with my dad. With the incredibly difficult decision to escape having been made, their goodbyes said, and exit visas in hand, my grandmother and dad headed to the city of Brest to get on the first train of their journey. They had been stripped of their Soviet citizenship and therefore at this point were stateless, with no passports or identification papers. Once they arrived at the train station, they were told